Hi, Robert. Thanks for helping with my project. Could you say a little bit about yourself?
I've had a long and varied career. My philosophy in life has always been one's work should be one's hobby. And so for many years, I was in the movie business. After, in the mid-90s, I finally got really sick, not of the work, but of the quality of what the movie business had become. It wasn't what I wanted to do. And so I decided to switch. I decided I was going to start writing. Since my interests in life have always been exploration, which means in exploring the unknown, pushing the unknown, and showing how you can be better than you are by doing that. I decided to start to focus on science journalism at that time. And that meant, because scientists are doing the same thing as a mountain climber, they're pushing the unknown. So I started to do that, and space exploration has always been a love of mine. And so that linked to that: astronomy, science, exploration, planetary research, astronomy. So after a while, I realized that unlike the film business, you can't make a living just doing freelance articles as a science journalist. In the movie business, you could freelance and just very quickly get a lot of the money, but just doing magazine articles wasn't sufficient. So I found I had to add to that writing books, which is all right with me. And so my first book was, I decided, this was around 98, and we were approaching the 20th anniversary, the 30th anniversary of the Apollo 8 mission to the moon. This was the Christmas Eve mission. It was the very first time human beings had ever left Earth orbit. They arrived in lunar orbit on Christmas Eve, and in one of the most, I would say, significant telecasts in human history till that point. They then read from the Old Testament, first 12 verses, while they orbited the moon. And I thought that mission, my memory of that mission, which gives me a slight advantage, I actually am an original source, I actually saw it happen. My memory of that mission, it was a significantly historical mission. It changed the country. It literally, the way I like to put it is, it took the country by the shoulders and shook it. And things changed after that mission, not always for the better. And it was an important mission. And I found in 98, it was pretty much forgotten. It had seemingly been forgotten. That mission was the one they took the first Earthrise picture. You might have seen it. Everyone has seen that picture. Always framed incorrectly.
Yes, it's supposed to be on the side.
It's supposed to be on the side. But so I decided that book needs to be written. So I decided, who am I? I've had a few magazine articles published, but that doesn't mean anything to me. If you want to do something, you do it. So I did a little bit of research. I was able to discover the business phone number of Frank Borman's new car sales dealership in Corpus Christi. And so I called it. And it happened to be lunch hour, which means the secretary was eating lunch. So who picks up the phone but Commander Borman himself? And I recognized his voice. And I said to him, "Is this Commander Borman?" And he said, yes, as if he's gotten these kind of calls before from strange people. And I proceeded to tell him what I was doing and what I wanted to do. He said, "Send me some clippings of your writings and I'll think about it." And 2 days later, he calls me up and says, "I'll not only help you, you can interview my wife. I will arrange to get you in touch with all the other astronauts." And I proceeded from there, wrote the book. And from there, I've written now 4 books. Most of my books actually touched upon the most important achievements, I think, of the 20th century in space. I wrote a book, The Universe in a Mirror, which tells the story of the people who designed, conceived, built, screwed up the Hubble Space Telescope, and then fixed it. And why they did it and the significance of that mission. I wrote a book called Leaving Earth, award-winning book, which is basically a history of post-Apollo manned spaceflight, which means it's mostly about space stations, which means it's mostly about what the Soviets and the Russians did from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I wrote it partly because growing up in the 60s and 70s, you would always there'd be news articles about every space mission and be covered really widely. After the Apollo missions, the news media decided this wasn't interesting anymore, even though there were millions that were interested. And so I would see things like on the 30th page at the bottom of a column, a 1-paragraph article from New York Times. 2 Russian astronauts launched to Salyut Station for a year-long mission. And then the next time it would be covered would be 1 year later on page 40 at the bottom of a column, a paragraph. 2 Russian astronauts, Soviet astronauts, return after a year-long mission. And I say to myself, my God, that's a record, a year-long mission in space. What happened? Of course, I couldn't find out. So I decided to write a book about that. And that's what Leaving Earth is. More recently, I've done policy papers. I wrote a policy paper called Capitalism in Space, which I published in 2017. And essentially, both Biden and the Trump administrations have accepted the recommendations of that policy paper almost exclusively. It's established the transfer from a government-run space program to a privately run space program in which the government's merely a customer. And it's basically what my recommendations are, and they've accepted it. And my most recent book is a book called Conscious Choice. And it's actually a history of early colonial America, but I wrote it with space exploration in mind. This is actually a book I spent almost 30 years researching. And always with the idea is the original British colonialists who came to the New World, North America, established a dozen plus colonies. Every one of them was slightly different. They were basically experiments of how you build a new society in the New World, in the wilderness. And their lessons that they learned and didn't learn, I think, apply directly to future colonies. So Conscious Choice, it's about the causes of slavery in the Virginia colony and why that did not occur in the northern colonies at all. The Puritan, Pilgrim, and Quaker colonies in the north did not happen. And it was surprising to happen in Virginia because British society did not have slavery and looked at it as abhorrent, as a terrible thing. So this is what started my question, how did Virginia end up having slavery? And I thought there'd be a lot of histories on it. There were none really that answered the question. So this is the way I do things. All right, no one's done it, I'll do it. And so I spent a lot of years researching it, published the book as an ebook last year, and I'm right now in the process of finalizing a print edition of that book, which should come out in about a month or so. So that's my history. And so basically that's who I am. I've been spending the last 25 years as a science journalist writing about space and science. I do that on my website, Behind the Black. And writing histories about the beginnings of space exploration.
Well, maybe you can explain the origins of the name of your website, Behind the Black. What does it mean to you?
Oh, sure. This comes, in fact, if you go to the website, the banner across the top will probably reveal the answer. But it comes from the black sky one sees behind the astronauts who went to the moon. The Apollo astronauts, they're walking around on the moon. And everyone who lived at that time always found it shocking how black that sky was. The assumption had been that, there'd be no atmosphere, you'd be able to see the stars. But the truth is, in the daytime, the sun is so bright that our eye pupils contract and we can't see the stars. Even though there's no atmosphere, you just see a black sky. And the cameras came off that way as well. And so you have a black sky. And so I suddenly said to myself, well, what's behind the black? And that is essentially the question that all the space exploration is asking. It's really what all exploration asks, from science to mountain climbing to building colonies on another world, is you're trying to extend humans' reach and understanding of the universe. I think the black sky of space epitomizes that. I have an essay in the paperback edition of Universe in a Mirror, talking about how exploration until Magellan had basically been, and the limits of human existence were not known. There was always more you could travel. We had never reached the ends of the earth. Magellan circled the globe. Suddenly there was an end to the exploration of the earth. We no longer had a limitless horizon. And what space exploration has given us now is a limitless horizon. Again, we go to space, it'll never end. We will be exploring space forever. And this is one of the reasons also I wrote Conscious Choice, because for the rest of human history, the most important problem we will face as we explore the heavens and build colonies, the most important difficulty we're going to have again and again and again is trying to figure out how to make a prosperous, just, good society in those new colonies for the people that live there. And so that's a question that's going to come up again and again and again. And I think the New World and what the British learned building America are lessons that apply directly to that.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about slavery and a future Mars colony, where you have the powers that be that control the air that you breathe and the amount of control that they will give them,
you,
it's,
you recognize the problem right away. And it's very, this is a very complicated issue. How do you build a great society, a proper society? And it's really interesting to see that in North America, the British, they had a variety of colonies, and some got it completely right. And it's one of the reasons the United States went from a very poor, tiny colonies on the eastern shore of North America in the 1600s to the world superpower, the only one to this day, that'll change eventually, but the only one to this day who can get and put humans on another world. And how did that happen? Well, once again, if you get it right, it works wonderfully for everybody. And so the northern colonies in North America, the New England Puritan and Pilgrim colonies and Rhode Island, those religious colonies, the Quaker colonies in Pennsylvania, and even New York, which is chaos even then. No one was in charge, but even then, they got it right. And the southern colonies led by Virginia did not. And there are very specific reasons why, and I go into it in great length. And it's amazing actually how this was almost like a controlled experiment to demonstrate what human society needs, both good and bad. Or at least what societies will develop, good and bad, if you don't do the right things. And they're directly applicable. So you got to start out with certain correct things. And I could go into some of those details. But for example, space is going to be a little different than, of course, the North American colony, because it's an engineering task. You're building everything. The colonists who came here could get food, they could grow plants, they had air, as you say, they could breathe. Where in space we're going to have to create everything, so that's going to create more power to engineering, and so that's an issue. And power is a major question here. If you do not diffuse power to as many people as possible right off the bat, you almost always create an unhealthy situation down the road. You have to value human life very highly and the rights of individuals very strongly. You have to structure the society. More than anything else, you have to structure the society around the concept of raising children. One of the things I have found in my last 30 years being involved in the space community, pro-space, L5 society, National Space Society, being among those people, is that nobody's really interested in children. What they're interested in is going where nobody has ever gone before. But that's really not what will be happening on Mars. What will be happening is they're building a society for their children. And so you have to focus everything around that. And if you do, you'll not only get to explore places no one's ever been before, but you'll create a place that your children can do the same thing in a prosperous kind of way. So those are some basics, but it gets more complicated than that. And I hadn't realized how profound early American history was in context to space exploration until I started to research the subject myself.
Well, I mean, just thinking about the challenges of freedom here on Earth, when you're on the ship, you're kind of under tight control. And whenever you go and dock and, disembark the ship, everybody can kind of go their own way. However, with space travel, with our options that we currently have available, essentially you're always living on a ship.
Let's think about the Mayflower and the Pilgrims that came over. They came over as a group. They landed and they were going to work together to create their own colony, just like space. They were not able to go anywhere they wanted. They were working together. They were under the rule of the Puritan leadership. They came together, but they came with very specific goals. One of the things the Puritans did and the Pilgrims is they came as family groups, specifically to find a place they could raise their kids the way they thought they should be raised. Now, they were religious groups. Some of their religious side, and they were Christian religious groups. Some of their Christian ideas were considered just 2 generations later in New England to be eccentric and were rejected. But the Christianity and the religious aspect of raising kids was not. And so they came with that focus in mind. The The Virginia colony did not. They came with the idea of making money solely. They came with a very skewed sex ratio, 3-to-1 men, a lot of men. You think of a gold rush boom mining town in either California or in the Yukon. And the old Westerns accurately portray this actually. It's very chaotic, a lot of drinking, a lot of taverns, a lot of drunkenness, a lot of violence. What guys do when they don't have a family around with them. And so the Virginia, to a certain extent, had that. And it resulted in an unhealthy place to raise kids. It's a lot more involved in how they treated the people involved. In the New England colonies, everybody came as a family unit to establish self-sufficient small farms to raise their kids and live on. In the South, in Virginia, you basically ended up with large plantations owned by a few wealthy royalists, lords, basically, descendants of lords from England, who created a system of labor whereby most of the people who worked for them were unpaid indentured servants, warping what indentured servitude was completely from what it was in England. And the result of that is they actually taught the next generation that it was a perfectly legitimate thing to own another person. And that was part of it. It could go on for a long time, but that's what conscious choice is about. And it really does teach us the lessons. You're sending Elon Musk sends a starship to Mars, 1 million people. If he goes with the right kinds of people, with the right goals in mind, even if engineering is the #1 job everyone's got, they will have a healthy society, as long as they're going with the idea of how they're going to build a place that they can raise their kids well. It focuses your mind very differently when you're thinking of that next generation for the little ones. If you're thinking only about, I want to explore space or make money, you don't really think about the ethics involved, the morality. Little children who are innocent makes you think about it.
Well, I just wonder, it's just
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we haven't yet talked about going back to the moon and Artemis, but that's okay.
But I just wonder, that whole quote about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And as long as there is central need for central people to take care of like the critical infrastructure, that's kind of like a power. So how important is it if we do colonize Mars for us to get the technology down to a level where you can exactly have 1 or 2 or 3 families that could be self-sufficient?
Well, this brings us to Artemis and my policy paper, Capitalism in Space, and what has been happening in the American space program for the last decade. I grew up with the space program, and until around 98, 2000, when I started to become a space journalist, I was always one of these guys, just like everybody else in the space community. We gotta help convince Congress to fund our space program. We've got to have a space program. We got to get it funded. We got to get money to NASA. And I was all for that. And it wasn't until I started to write these histories and do some research that I realized that, and I began to despise the word program, because what does it imply? When we went to the moon in the 60s, John Kennedy sent us there to specifically tell the world that a Soviet-style top-down program is not how you do it. You do it by competing, free companies and people with their own ideas making things happen. That was the idea. Unfortunately, he used the Soviet-style space program to do it. And so everybody in the 60s, this is one of the lessons I learned from Genesis, Star of Apollo 8. What came out of the 60s was the wrong lessons. Americans suddenly decided to go to space. You needed a program. Something the government top down dictates to everybody else. And for the next 50 years, we had a space program that accomplished diddly squat. It really didn't get anything accomplished. It went around and around the Earth in the shuttle. If you read shuttle press kits in the 80s and 90s, they are a great vehicle to fall asleep any way you want. They made this program as boring as they could because their goal was not to explore space. Their goal was a jobs program for the government. Just keep it going for as long as possible. Take as little risk as possible. I don't want a space program. What I want is, and this is what we're getting now, and this will answer your question about setting up a colony elsewhere, diffusing power. What I want is a chaotic aerospace effort, space effort in space, many different people doing many different things, following their own dreams competitively. And so, for example, we now have, off the top of my head, 4 different private space station projects under development, all going to compete with each other. So you, as a potential customer who wants to go to space for any number of reasons, including business reasons, are going to have 4 space stations to choose from. That means every one of those space stations are going to be run somewhat differently. It means they have to treat their customers with some respect, or else the customers will go elsewhere. And so that's diffusing power down from the top to the bottom. And that is a way to protect the future colonists on other planets, because then eventually you get to Mars. It's not just going to be Elon Musk if this continues this way. There's going to be more than one company establishing colonies on Mars to compete with Musk. And they're all going to have to face the possibility that people will go elsewhere if they don't do it right. And so that's one way you diffuse things right away. You diffuse it by not having it all run by one government. You have it run by competing private companies who own what they do and try to do it right. Now, there's more to it than that. In Virginia, they did have private enterprise, but they were focused solely on money making. And once again, you have to be thinking about other things when you do it. But this is an example. The transition the United States experienced in the last decade from a government-run program that did everything and told everybody what it was going to do, to a private system where the government is only a customer and buys the product from private companies that compete against each other, and then can also sell that product to others as well. That transition has opened the door to a bigger boom in space than anyone ever has imagined in the last 50 years. I can tell you that my parents imagined this. They honestly thought this is what was going to happen in the 70s, because they lived in a society where private enterprise did it. The government didn't do it. But since they set up the space program as a government-run operation, by error, they created a framework, a cultural framework where we continue to do that. So the competition went away. One of the stories that I've written about that hasn't gotten much play is the history of satellite communications in the United States. In the early 60s, when the ability to get satellites into orbit became much more practical, AT&T immediately wanted to launch its own private constellation of communication satellites in the early 60s to provide telephone communications worldwide. This was to replace the undersea cables, which didn't have much capacity, were much more expensive to build, and didn't last very long. And they figured that in terms of how much money they'd invest, it was going to be very cheap. And to prove it, they bought their own rocket launch and they built their own satellite Telstar. And they proved that this could work. And so what happens, Kennedy comes along and Congress comes along and says, we don't want AT&T to have that private control. So we're going to set up a government-run satellite company called Comcast. And all communication satellites in the United States have to be launched through Comcast, top-down system. And it literally squelched the American free enterprise in space for the next decade and a half. It wasn't until the Nixon administration in the early 70s canceled that private companies like television companies wanted to launch satellites to do television broadcasts. They couldn't do it. They weren't allowed. They started to be able to do it in the 70s, and we suddenly had a communications industry that was competitive and free. But what had happened, we lost a decade because we suddenly thought Congress and the government should be on charge of anything. And so that's transition we're in right now is a very positive thing, and I hope it keeps going. That's my number one concern. Will it keep going? We'll have to see.
You know, in software, we have like open source and closed source. And there was about 2 or 3 decades ago, an essay printed, you know, talking about how the difference between the Cathedral and the Bazaar. And so I was thinking that kind of illustrates what you're talking about.
The idea of the cathedral and the bazaar, it's basically the insiders and the outsiders. It's basically the outsiders provide some competition, which eventually cause the insiders who control things to either break up or back down or innovate and change themselves. That's a certain idea of it. America was actually designed with no cathedral. That's one thing has to be understood by Americans. They do not know this anymore. They're not taught history very well. But America was specifically designed, the Constitution and the Declaration of Rights, and the culture that existed in America in the 1700s had no cathedral. It was basically a free-for-all for each individual to do what they wished. And so they were constantly competing with each other to come up with the best solutions. And yes, in the 1800s, you start to get the larger railroad and oil companies getting bigger and bigger. But the truth is, they were still under a bizarre situation. They did not bizarre and strange, but the outsiders constantly pecking at them. If they didn't do it right, they were going to lose their business. And we kind of lost sense of that in the 20th century. And it's very important for us to recognize that if you can set up a society without a cathedral, and it'll be much more prosperous in the long run. And if a cathedral by nature is that top-down authoritarian concept which limits freedom. It's afraid of freedom, and so it tries to limit it. And what is America? One of the principles, functions of America is freedom. Allow people to follow their dreams, and wherever they go, they take it and live with the risk of that. And it means you have competition. I'll give you another example in Russia today. Russia, the Soviet Union falls, they have the opportunity to bring in capitalism and free enterprise. They don't understand it. And it's a real tragedy because for the first decade and a half after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia had a booming economy. It had one of the highest GPDs in the world, like 8% a year. They were going great guns. When I was writing Leaving Earth, I spent a month and a half in Moscow. And
is this back during when Boris Yeltsin was president?
Yes, Boris Yeltsin was a brilliant man and a great man, and he's unfortunately much forgotten. A lot of Americans think of Gorbachev, who was really a failure. It was Yeltsin who, there's a great story that Yeltsin tells in his memoirs about his first trip to the United States, where he gets to see an American supermarket for the first time. And his response to it is almost tears. He said, "What have we done to our people that we can't do this?" And he started to look into what worked. And of course, he's going from total ignorance. So he didn't quite understand it, but he really tried to create an open competitive system. But what failed in Russia is they don't allow competition. What they instead did is all the old Soviet design bureaus and in the aerospace industry that were building rockets and satellites and missiles, they didn't go away. What they did is they instead, like the old mobs during Prohibition, they divided up the industry into territories. And Energia builds manned space. Nobody else can do it. They do it. Some other companies build rockets. That's that area. No one else can do it. Some companies build certain kinds of satellites. That's their territory. Nobody else can do it. So what happens is if a new company comes along trying to make a new startup rocket company, government comes down on them and blocks it. They basically are told, that's a nice business you got there. You want to keep it, you're going to have to work with the company that exists already. And so they don't have competition. And what ends up happening when you don't have competition is dry rot sets in, and the companies that do exist start to become corrupt and inefficient, and they don't do a very good job. And that's been Russia's history for the last decade and a half. That's one of the reasons they lost all their commercial business. They couldn't launch rockets successfully, reliably. Still have that problem. And so Russia is an example of that, where the cathedral continues to dominate. Fortunately, there is a great strength in American culture, despite the last decade and a half, where there's a great, more than a decade and a half, since the 60s in the United States, there's been a cultural imperative to try to strengthen the cathedral here over endlessly. But the culture of our country still is very freedom-oriented, bottom-up. And even though it was a real battle in the last 2 decades to finally break the monopoly NASA and the government had on space exploration, It did. All it took was one or two individuals who had the resources, like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others, who had the resources to push forward, and the government couldn't stop them. And that broke that lock on freedom. And so we now have a commercial business. And because the society doesn't look badly upon that, we actually look very badly on a government trying to limit competition as a general culture. So that's a fundamental of our culture, and it's a good thing, and I hope it stays. That'll make it possible. You know, I do on Behind the Black, every time there's a launch, I post the leaders in the year's launch race to give you an idea of which companies and nations are being successful in space right now. And then at the end of the year, I do a global full analysis. But it's really interesting right now, the United States, with all its different companies combined, no government launches at all, has more launches than all other countries combined. And all other countries is pretty much government projects. There is very little private enterprise in any place else in the world. The United Kingdom's trying to do it now. The European Space Agency says they want to do it, but they act much like the Russians. They really don't know how to do it. And the Russians, of course, don't have it. The Chinese actually are trying very hard to create a commercial competitive business. But since everything has to be approved by the Communist Party and the People's Republic, the Army, it doesn't have the freedom that a true competitive industry would have. People don't own what they launch, really. They're dictated what they have to do by the government. In the United States, if a guy wants to build a heavy lift rocket that can lift 100 tons into orbit, not knowing who his customers would be, and he has the resources, he can go ahead and do it, and he's doing it. If another guy wants to build a small sat rocket that can only lift maybe 1,000 pounds because he thinks he can get business that way, he can go ahead and do it. And the truth is, they're both making money at it because the customers arrive. They're providing a need, filling a need.
And you know, some of those people are from New Zealand.
Well, it's an interesting thing about Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab is an American company. When they started to launch, I had a period of time. Well, should I list them under New Zealand or should I list them under the United States? For a month or two, I listed them under New Zealand, but then Beck, Robert, I'm forgetting his first name, Beck, the owner of the company.
Peter Beck.
Thank you. Peter Beck actually had, during a press conference, mentioned, maybe he saw on my website, he said, well, I just want to make it clear, we are an American company that has a lot of our facilities in New Zealand. And so he's listed as an American company, and he very much wants to be an American company because a lot of the business, military and governmental business, is going to come, and NASA is going to come from the United States, and there are reasons why he couldn't get that business if he wasn't an American company. So yes, he set his operations up in New Zealand for financial reasons. It was cheaper and smarter. But in the end, he wants to have a lot of it launching from the United States and built in the United States. His neutron rocket's going to be built at Wallops Island in Virginia, and it's going to launch from Wallops Island in Virginia. He's really making it clear he wants to launch out of the United States because that's where the business is.
I understand his need to go that way, but you know, my understanding is that his electron rocket and the first launches were completely done in New Zealand by New Zealand people.
Yes.
Which I think is a very important thing, because when I talk to people from Egypt or from Pakistan or from Chile or from Argentina and from you know, South Africa, and they're like, you know, how can we get into space because we're not in America where all the space stuff has happened. I like to pull Peter Beck out of the bag and say, you know, he did it. And if you could do it from New Zealand, and I don't mean to, you know, put New Zealand down, but there's definitely bigger countries with bigger economies out there who haven't achieved that yet. There's no, it's not size that's keeping them from doing it.
Absolutely correct. And there's an essay that I linked to that I wrote back in about 2002 when I was doing a weekly column for UPI. And I called it the New Colonial Movement. For those that know history, I'm a historian, during the 1800s, the European powers decided they wanted to colonize the world. They proceeded to dominate Africa and Asia and create colonies where there were already civilizations and other societies. In many cases, it was actually beneficial for the places they went to. Oh my God, I'm going to be canceled by saying that, but it's true. But not in some cases, it wasn't true. It was very negative. But either way, there was a colonial movement, a grab for power to places that were not controlled by Europe. Well, in space, we're going to have the same thing. We have it right now. There is a new colonial movement. All countries worldwide want to get, there's a vacuum in space, no pun intended, and they want a piece of that pie. And so you have a new colonial movement. And the United Arab Emirates is a great example of exactly what you just said, Nathan, because their leaders want to diversify their economy, and just depending on oil income, they know is not really in the long run a good thing. And so they decided very wisely, I think, that space will inspire their youth, and it's a technology that is demanding of people, and so it's going to help them grow. And so they picked space as the way to do it. Now, that culture is very top-down, so they are running it as a top-down system. They might say it's private enterprise, but they're lying. It's a top-down government Soviet-style system, but they're trying to create an industry and have space exploration as one of their nation's goals. And I would say they're using their significant capital that they have available to them very wisely to train their people so that people can start to do this themselves. And then there are other places like India, which is trying to now make the transition from a government-run system to private enterprise. And India is interesting because their government space agency, ISRO, they decided almost several decades ago that they weren't going to dictate a space exploration program. Their goal was going to get market share in the launch industry. So they actually were acting like a private company to get market share. And now what's happening is the Modi government, which tends to be conservative and for free enterprise, is pressuring ISRO to create vehicles for private companies to begin to compete independent of ISRO. Now they're not succeeding quite yet, but they're trying to emulate what the United States is doing. I have found in a lot of other places in the world, I could talk about the United Kingdom, which for many years emulated the US NASA program, or didn't cut it off completely. But when they then started to try to recreate their space effort, they first were going to try to copy a space program and then quickly abandoned it and instead went with the modern model of the government acts as the servant and customer and does whatever it can to encourage private competitive companies from succeeding. And I think it's paying off for the UK. And China, it's interesting because China, it's all government controlled, but they have tried to create a situation where there could be private companies getting private investment capital from within the Chinese industry and banking system to have their own companies building rockets for profit. Their problem in this structure is that the rockets being built are going to be they can't just freely sell their product to everyone. They are to a certain extent controlled by what they can make by the government, but nonetheless, they're trying to do it, and they're doing much better than the Russians did. They're creating some competition, and that's a good thing. At the minimum, they're creating competition for government business. While in Russia, it's basically crony, it would be what we call crony capitalism. There isn't capitalism, but it's basically these very big companies that exist are hand in glove with the Putin government, and there is no competition from anybody else allowed. China's trying to create a situation where at least within the framework of government control, there is real competition. And I give them credit for that, though, once again, the communist government, they're going to lose in the end. Japan's an example of they're trying now to emulate what the US is doing. They didn't quite get there. They're not quite there yet. And it's kind of embarrassing for Japan because here's a very successful capitalist country who is embarrassed by what India and China is doing right now in space. They should have been ahead of those countries years and years ago. They were the first ones to launch commercial satellites into orbit, partly because of the COMSAT law that blocked the US, but nonetheless, they were the first. And so they're embarrassed by that. And so they're trying to shift control from government-run rockets to privately built rockets. So their next generation rocket that Mitsubishi is building for JAXA, their space agency, they're trying to shift the responsibility and ownership of that to Mitsubishi. whether they're succeeding is a question mark right now. But I would say your point about other countries, yes, I want them to succeed. The competition is always better. So I want competition with the United States, with many private companies, but I think it's great to have competition on the international market because in space exploration, because that competition fuels innovation and it fuels more achievement. We tried international cooperation for the last half century, and what did we get? We didn't get much. And I always said it wasn't going to give us much because it ends up to be very bureaucratic and risk averse, and nothing really happens. It's a bureaucracy. You get competition, you got to get rid of the bureaucracy, but you got to get things done, or else you won't get the business. And that applies to China versus the US versus Russia versus other countries. You know, Russia is in a very bad way right now because they haven't done a good job of promoting an innovative aerospace industry, and they're really losing their dominance badly. And they, in the next 5 years, their whole space program could go kaput. They don't have the money right now to build their own space station. They want to do it because they're not going to be on ISS much longer because they say they're leaving. And besides, ISS is going away, and the private space stations that are going to replace it are not going to want to partner with the Russians. They're just not going to want to, not unless they make a deal that the Russians might not like. And so Russia's got problems, and the competition from others is going to force them to maybe reconsider how they do things. That would be good for Russia. That would be good for the Russian people. That would be good for their aerospace industry. And I would celebrate that. I would want them to achieve things in space competitively so that their own people can follow their own dreams. That's what freedom's all about.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I've made you speechless. I'm sorry.
Well, and so a couple of questions I had for you. One is, when did you find out, you talked about America being the only country in the world that's been able to put people on the moon. We haven't done that for almost 50 years. And I was wondering when and how you found out that we're planning to actually send them back to the moon.
Well, all right, the premise of your question I don't accept. The premise of your question is that Artemis and NASA's program with SLS is going to succeed, and it's garbage. And I've been saying it's garbage for now more than a decade. In fact, when Artemis was first proposed, it wasn't called Artemis. When George Bush Jr. proposed in 2004 that we go back to the moon, we build the crew exploration vehicle, which is now Orion, and we create rocket to send us to the moon and beyond, I was very upset because, once again, he was building a government's Kennedy top-down program that we had had repeated failures now for 50 years. And I was really disappointed, but that's what he was doing. Well, it got canceled by Obama and replaced with the SLS. And when that happened, I said, this is a mess. It's a terrible thing, but it's maybe the best thing could happen, because now it's going to allow for the private companies to start to compete successfully. And that was what was happening. And I figured it was going to take a decade for the American aerospace industry and the government to completely transition from a government completely run system to a private enterprise system. It's almost taking exactly a decade. And that's exactly where we are right now. I will toot my own horn and say that my capitalism space policy paper was a big player. And I know when I published it, it was published by a think tank in Washington, D.C. that had been founded by a Republican and a Democrat to try to develop partisan thinking about international defense and international issues the United States has to face. And their guy wanted a paper on the state of the American aerospace industry and how that should be viewed by the federal government. And I gave him a policy paper. He then made sure it was distributed to almost everybody in the federal government. I know he handed it personally to Mike Pence when he was vice president, which meant the National Space Council got it. I know I got calls from many people in the federal government for the next year asking me about it, because they were offices of management and budget call. They were really interested in this. And what it did was the Trump administration initially was copying the Kennedy-like approach. You had Pence make his speech about, we're going to put humans, American boots on the moon by 2024. And it was really like right out of Kennedy again, and out of Reagan, and out of Clinton, and out of Bush 1 and Bush 2, making this this great speech about before this decade is out, we're going to do something. And of course, it never happens. So I was very worried that's where Trump was going. But over the next, my paper came out in 17, early in his administration. Over the next 2 years, that administration shifted gears steadily towards encouraging private enterprise to make the government the customer. They wouldn't build anything. They canceled projects where NASA was designing it and instead hired private companies to build things instead. And that transition has now continued with the Biden administration, which is really encouraging because presidents tend to throw out what the previous president did and just do something new. And what's been interesting is that a lot of this capitalism concepts was started in the actually started in the Bush Jr. administration, right at the end, continued during the Obama administration, but always given second place to big space and government programs. With the Trump administration, they started to shift to put the private enterprise in charge and devalue the government programs. And that the Biden administration is now very clearly continuing this. Last week, or was it early this week, Bill Nelson, Biden's administrator of NASA, who had been a senator for 30 years pushing cost-plus contracts and the big government-run programs, came out, testified in front of the Senate Appropriations Committee, a subcommittee of that committee, stating he considered cost-plus contracts a plague on NASA. That's a quote. And we should go to fixed-price contracts entirely, one of the other recommendations of Capital and Space, because that forces private companies to be careful with how much they spend and to do it efficiently. And he says, and do it quickly. And he says, that's what we need to have happen. So it's very clear, Biden administration is continuing this process. So when did I realize we were going to go back to the moon? When they finally started to transition to having private enterprise be the provider instead of the government doing it. Every time since Reagan's announcement of building a space station by the end of the 90s. That really happened, didn't it? I have been skeptical of every one of these announcements. When George Bush Sr. announced, we're going to go back to the moon, nothing happened. When George Bush Jr. announced it, it kind of happened, but not very much. And we're still waiting for that first launch. It's now almost 20 years since he made that announcement. It hasn't happened yet. So I've always looked at that and saying, hogwash, it's not going to happen to the government. When we started to allow private enterprise the ability, that's when I knew it was going to happen. And so that, now think about it. And I would say maybe in the most significant moment of truth in this transition from government run to private run was the announcement last year that NASA had awarded SpaceX the lunar manned lander contract using Starship. And I wrote an essay on that saying, my God, and that when that happened, I reviewed Capital and Space and I was like gobsmacked because I hadn't realized how much my recommendations were being followed by the federal government. And it struck me right then and there. It isn't private enterprise. It isn't the government doing it anymore. The government is now honestly admitted we're not going to get it done unless we let private enterprise do it for us. And so that's when I knew we're going back to the moon. Artemis, you'll notice how Artemis is changing. It was originally SLS and Orion. Orion is such a lie. Orion is an ascent-descent capsule. Orion was never going to take us beyond the Earth. And they say that, NASA, and it's a lie. It's just an overpriced, overweight ascent-descent capsule. You could, you get a big, you make an interplanetary spaceship like the ISS. You use an ascent capsule to put your crew on it. This is one of the simpler ways you could do it. They go off to Mars. They might have a descent vehicle to get down to Mars and an ascent vehicle to get back up. They come back to Earth. They have a descent capsule, Orion, to get back to the ground. Orion has nothing to do with that. So that was the initial Artemis program. Well, now the Artemis program is almost nothing to do with SLS and Orion. NASA has issued contracts all over the place to private companies to put up unmanned lunar landers. They're now trying to get manned lunar landers for possibly 2 different companies. There's push in Congress now to finance the second company. So there's competition there and innovation. You have planetary missions are shifting more and more to having private companies develop the services for the science community and for NASA. And so we are on the verge of a renaissance that will be more than spectacular. There are things that could kill it. The Ukraine war is an example of outside forces that could destroy everything. But if this continues as it is, the United States stands a very good chance of being the most dominant nation in space for many centuries to come.
It's an exciting future. And talking about private trips to the moon, I was wondering what your thoughts were of the Dear Moon project.
Oh, that one was right when that was first released. Wait a minute, make sure I'm not talking about the right thing. Is Dear Moon the thing that the Japanese billionaire is doing? Okay, I was thinking of something else. Look, he's got a lot of money. He wants to go to the moon. He's found ways to buy tickets to do space exploration. He bought a ticket with the Russians to go up to ISS. He wanted to go. He's talked to SpaceX, and he's bought a mission to go circle the moon and come back on Starship. All power to him. The key here is that I believe in freedom. So if he wants to do it, all power to him. If he's got the money, who am I to say he should or shouldn't? Who is anyone's right to say he should or shouldn't? If SpaceX has got the product that he can sell and he's got the money that wants to buy, go for it. That's fine with me. Whether, I'm getting too old to even consider going on these missions. They wouldn't pick me anyway because I'm getting too old. Even though I do cave exploration and I've gone where no one has ever gone before, I'm not the first choice anymore, and that's okay with me. But I think all power to them. Anyone that has a dream and wants to follow it and finds a way to make it happen, then all power to them. I have no problem. But one has to look with some realistic eye. One can't, as a journalist, I cannot look at these things with rose-colored glasses, pie in the sky. I've got to look at them seriously. I'll give you an example. When you first said that, I was thinking of and I can't even remember the name of it now. It was a proposal about a decade ago. Dennis Tito was involved in it, whereby they were going to send a one-way mission to Mars.
Yeah, I think that was Inspiration Mars.
That's right, Inspiration Mars. And right off the bat, this is hogwash. This is a scam, and I'm all for them having their dreams. But let's look at the reality of what they're proposing, and it's garbage. It's not going to happen. And it didn't happen. They went bankrupt. And that's, as a journalist, I've got to be able to I've got to separate the wheat from the chaff. I'm not against their dream, but I'm going to look at the reality of their dream to say whether it's possible or not.
Credibility. You're looking for a credibility.
There's got to be credibility. I mean, look, think of it as a viable way. I'm providing journalism reporting on the space industry right now. To a great extent, customers who might be interested in buying the product might use my resource to figure out which ones to buy. And so you got to just tell them, well, I think this one's not working very well, and that one is a good one. And it's got to be a credible, and my track record is pretty good. I make predictions and they're routinely correct because I really have a good sense of how this works. So yeah, that was an example. We got to look. I'll give you another example of asteroid mining. A bunch of Google investors got together, and I can't even remember the name of their company, and saying, we're going to be mining the asteroids. And I looked at that, and all the press was like immediately saying, oh my God, they're going to mine the asteroids. Google's involved. And I said, this is hogwash. The only thing they've proposed is to put up a small space telescope, a very small space telescope, on a small sat, like a CubeSat, that would do some observations, maybe of asteroids, maybe of the Earth. That's all they maybe have proposed right now. By the way, it hasn't flown. They never flew. The company's out of business. I said, this is garbage. This is not going to happen. And it didn't happen. So you got to look seriously. You can't just read press releases and rewrite them. You've got to look at what's going on and make this and describe and look at it honestly. But the distinction between looking at what someone proposes honestly and analyzing it honestly and critiquing it so you can find out whether it's real or not is not the same thing as condemning someone's dream. I never do that. Someone has a dream to go into space, all power to them. I want them to succeed. I want them though to do it smart. If they do it stupid, they're not going to get it done. And so that, let's try to be smart about this. This is engineering. You can't fool yourself. If you try to fool yourself, you ain't going anywhere. Richard Branson fooled himself. He came up with he tried to design his Virgin Galactic system in a way that was not letting the engineers rule. And the result of that is it didn't get built. It's a failure. The company might survive, but I doubt seriously. And to a certain extent, it's an interesting thing. I have strong political disagreements with Doug Messier, who does parabolic arc as a website similar to mine. He's a good journalist. And he was the first guy to uncover the fact that Virgin Galactic was maybe a Potemkin village, wasn't really going to go anywhere. And he started to make me look more closely at that company and realize that, yeah, this is not going to go anywhere. And it's a sad thing. You want him to succeed, but if you don't do it smart, it's no good. Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin is a great example of this. In 15 and 16, they were amazing. I really thought they were going to be moving in to compete directly with SpaceX very quickly. And that meant their New Glenn orbital rocket would be flying very soon, using first stages, and be a direct competitor with SpaceX, which would be great, which would be absolutely great. But then come 17 or so, I began to notice that all announcements about further testing of their BE-4 rocket engine, which they rely on for the New Glenn orbital rocket, as well as ULA's Vulcan rocket, all announcements of testing had ceased. And for a year, there were no announcements. And then for another 6 months, no announcements. And they kept pushing back their announcements of when it would be available. And I then said almost 5 years ago, this company's got a problem there. And there's a problem, and they better get it straightened out. But they're making it very clear to me there's a problem. And if there's a problem there, that means both ULA with its Vulcan rocket and Blue Origin with its New Glenn rocket have problems. That means the military has a problem because they want to use those. It means we all have problems because we don't have competition. I said that back in 17 and 18, and where are we today? We still are waiting for the BE-4 engine delivery of a flight-worthy engine to ULA. We're still waiting. Hopefully, they say this summer it will arrive. If it doesn't arrive this summer, the ULA is in real deep trouble because they're not building any more Atlas Vs. And once those Atlas Vs run out, if they don't have a rocket to replace it, and they need the BE-4 engine for it, they're in trouble. The military is then in trouble because it doesn't have any other rocket company right now except SpaceX to launch things, because once the Atlas V goes, there's nobody else if the BE-4 engine doesn't start flying. So once again, you look closely, you keep an open mind, and you don't take any press release at face value and then make the distinction between one and the other. And this applies to NASA. Artemis, too much of the press just rewrites the press releases from NASA, like NASA's achieving things. If you read Behind the Black, my website, closely, you will notice that I never say NASA suddenly created something. I will almost always say engineers for this probe, the science team for this probe, or the actual makers of the object, not NASA, have achieved this or that, because NASA doesn't really do much. It really is other people that are making this happen, and I'm going to be very clear about that. So when NASA has a press release, like today, they had we're recording this, the Dragon Endurance capsule was going to be splashing down in the Atlantic shortly, in about an hour and a half, when we record this. NASA's press releases all make it sound like it's a NASA achievement. NASA has nothing to do with it. It's a totally private mission. When they're at ISS, yes, they're working with NASA, and they have to coordinate with NASA because the passengers are NASA astronauts. But the capsule, the splashdown crew, the splashdown recovery ship, the communication systems, everything is coming through a private company. Every person you see that's helping that capsule get on board the ship is a SpaceX employee. It's not NASA. And too much of the press will say it's NASA, and it's not NASA. So this is always, you got to always look at things very, very coldly to analyze them properly and not just take things at face value. This is why Artemis, I have not had any faith in Artemis as it's originally proposed for the first decade. Now, different story. We're going to see how it goes in the future.
Well, you talked about, the top down versus having a whole bunch of free enterprise. Back in the 1990s, we did have a brief moment where it looked like we might go the free enterprise route. And I'm thinking about Beal Aerospace. I was wondering if you remember Beal Aerospace.
Say the name again.
Beal, B-E-A-L.
Oh, Bell. Yeah. Well, he wanted to invest a lot of money in space stations, didn't he? Or was it rocket?
Oh, well, he actually built a rocket. In fact, SpaceX's McGregor facility is the old Bell rocket testing facility.
All right. Well, okay. Here's the thing. What was going on prior to the 2008 contract to SpaceX and originally Kistler that became Orbital ATK to bring cargo to ISS. Prior to that, almost all the investment capital that could go into space was reluctant to invest because NASA controlled everything and NASA dictated everything. And it was very difficult to get anything built competitively at a lower cost. We needed, unfortunately, a very wealthy person to build it, fly it, and make it cost effective to compete with NASA. That's what Elon Musk essentially did. We needed that. And so in the 90s, and even earlier than that, in the 80s, there were attempts to make private rockets to compete and provide services, not just to NASA, but to others. But they were always faced with limited capital and possibly engineering limitations having to do with who they hire. If they don't do it right, and it blows up or it doesn't fly, then you can't make it work. And so and you had NASA aggressively, and the big space contractors that worked for NASA, like Lockheed Martin and Boeing, aggressively working to block that. One of the reasons, for example, SpaceX is as much as possible vertically integrated. They build everything in-house, is because early on, Elon Musk discovered if he subcontracts anything out, he's going to find himself at the mercy of the subcontractor, who gets a lot more money from the big space people, who might pressure them to sabotage SpaceX. And this stuff happened. And it did happen earlier than that as well. So he vertically integrated, so he built everything himself, so he wasn't at the mercy of subcontractors. And that freed him from the pressure that was applied by the big space contractors that worked with NASA that were like the Russian big companies that don't want competition. They're doing something that's called competition. And to a great extent, in the 80s and 90s, the cartel between NASA and the big space contractors worked very hard to make it very difficult for new companies to come along. I do not know the specifics of Vail anymore. I used to. Bigelow is a good example of someone with big money trying to make his own space station, but partly through his own somewhat eccentric personality, and partly because of the cartel between a lot of people who work at NASA who broke off from NASA to create Axiom and then stepped in and stole the idea from Bigelow. He's not in the game anymore. He's been pushed out. So there's a lot of that going on. You have to do it right. If you don't do it right, it doesn't work. There are something like 100 small sat rocket companies right now trying to compete with Rocket Lab. If a third of them succeed, I'll be surprised.
If two of them succeed, I'd be surprised.
We have three operational right now.
That's right,
Lab,
Firefly,
Virgin Orbit,
and
Astra.
at Astra.
That's three operational. And in the next year, this year, there are 4 others that say they're going to do their first launch this year: Firefly, ABL, Aviom, and Relativity. All say they're going to do their first launch this year. Well, I don't think they all will, but they all are saying so. And there are a number of others right on the verge in the next year or so as well. What'll happen over time is that there'll be consolidation. This is like the car industry back in the early 20th century. A lot of different companies built in garages, small, and they eventually consolidated, and you have fewer companies as the industry matured. And that'll happen here as well, but you have the competition. What SpaceX and Elon Musk did is he illustrated for a lot of these investors the correct way to go. He showed them that you have to vertically integrate as much as possible. If you don't vertically integrate, you've got to go with subcontractors who you can trust, who will do it right. And that's one of the reasons a lot of these companies are now becoming more successful. I'll bet you that was one of the reasons Peter Beck went to New Zealand, because he isolated himself from the politics in the United States of big contractors trying to sabotage him. He isolated.
Isn't Peter Beck a Kiwi?
What's that?
I said, isn't Peter Beck a Kiwi?
He might be, yes, but he wants to have an American company. Without any, I don't know this, but when I put pieces together, they sometimes fit. And it seems to me that as one of the reasons he succeeded then is because when he started his company, he set it up in New Zealand. Maybe he wasn't conscious of this, but I suspect he was, because he saw what happened to SpaceX and he knew the history. And he said, if I do it in New Zealand, I'll isolate myself from those problems. I will vertically integrate in New Zealand, and I'll be separated from the kind of political games that sometimes sabotage new companies. And so that might have been a factor for his success. Even if he wasn't conscious of it, that might have been a factor for his success. A lot of the newer companies right now are very conscious of this relativity. They say you want to 3D print everything. Well, that's vertically integrating to the nth degree. It's taking control entirely out of anyone else's hands. And a lot of the other companies are doing the same thing. And then you've got within the big space companies an attempt to compete. Lockheed Martin, which does not really anymore have any kind of launch capabilities because they basically gave it up when they formed ULA with Boeing. Lockheed Martin is investing a lot of money in two different companies. It invested a lot of money in Rocket Lab, by the way, and now it's invested money in two different in a company that's trying to launch out of Scotland at the Shetland launch site, and they're trying to develop their own small sat rocket using a different corporate name, but nonetheless they're investing in this. They want to do it. They're competing. They're trying to compete, and instead of sabotaging others, they're trying to compete, and that's the end result. That's the good thing. We will get back to the moon very quickly in the next decade if we continue to allow these private companies to do this. If NASA continues to buy the product on the open market and let private companies compete. For example, you know, in the next 2 years, we're going to have almost a dozen, almost, not quite, but almost a dozen private commercial unmanned lunar landers go to the moon. Almost a dozen. All privately built. They all are selling, NASA's paying for the mission to put its science instruments on the landers or rovers to do research on the moon. They're all small. They're only going to work for the first lunar day or so. They're not designed necessarily to last through lunar night. So they're small missions, but they're inexpensive. And what they're doing is providing a lot of private companies the ability to learn how to build a planetary lander that they can then upscale and make so sophisticated and sell that product to others. So for example, they're sending these payloads for NASA to the moon, but there's room on every one of these landers for additional payloads. And every single one of them is trying to sell space to other customers. And they're getting, I don't have a full list, but I've seen repeatedly where they make a press release and they announce how we've sold another payload for our lunar lander that we're sending up for NASA, a private payload for somebody else. And that's where the future will lie. And it'll be very exciting because it'll be chaotic. And it'll be lots of different ideas and different dreams competing with each other. And my gosh, that's so much more exciting than a space program. Let me tell you.
No, you're definitely right. But talking about the futures and your power of prediction,
okay,
where do you think we would get in 200 years?
Oh, well, that's easy. I've already written it. I wrote it in 1985. I wrote a science fiction book called Pioneer in 1985. In those days, you didn't have ebooks and you needed an agent, and I was incompetent in getting an agent at that time, couldn't get one, and I couldn't get the book published, so I put it aside. And then about 6-7 years ago, I get a call from some Hollywood hack and I recognized him from my days in Hollywood, who's asking me as a science journalist, do I have any great ideas we can make movies on? And he was a hack. I wasn't going to give him anything. But he made me think about this book that was in my file cabinet that I hadn't read in 30 years. So I pull it out and I said, well, let me read it. Maybe it should be published. I don't know. It's a first novel. First novels, and I'm as in the screenwriting business, and I was in the first novels almost invariably bad. So I figured, well, it would probably be bad. So I start to read it. And I don't remember it very well. So I mean, I'm really reading it like an ordinary reader. And I turned to my wife about 50 pages in. I say, my God, this is good. And I'm saying that honestly. I was very surprised. And so I said, well, it's published. So I got it published. And the thing is, I wrote it in 85. I did a little update, not very much. I wanted to leave it as it was because there was very little that needed to be changed. I wrote it with my vision of what the future would be like from an American old-fashioned perspective, where it's not a government program, you're a free enterprise in space. And so there's one word, and I say this in my introduction, I'll give it away here. I don't say what the word is. I say in my introduction to the book, there's one word you won't find here that's found in every other science fiction movie and book that's always there that's not in my book. And that word is NASA. I don't ever mention NASA at all in the future of a colony on Mars. An independent, united lunar nation had already won its revolutionary freedom from the United States on the moon. You do not have NASA. You have a private enterprise and competing and individuals trying to survive in a very hostile environment in space. So in 200 years from now, I honestly think there's going to be some lunar colonies. There's going to be a lunar colonies for sure. They're going to be competing, probably there's going to be a Chinese colony for sure. There's going to be an American colony, or maybe several private American colonies. You know, you might have something going on along those lines. And you might have a situation where very quickly as these colonies develop self-sufficiency, and they won't be self-sufficient initially. That's the same problem that the American colonies had. Think about it. The British colonies were first settled in 1607 to about 1630. It was 140 years before the Declaration of Independence. People forget how long that time period was between the first colonies and the establishment of the free United States. It takes a while. So I wouldn't be so surprised that in the next 100 years, we start getting colonies, and it's at least 200 years beyond that before they become self-sufficient to be able to run on their own. If they establish themselves with the right ideas, then they will be able to become self-sufficient more quickly and then become independent more quickly, or at least be run more intelligently. They don't have to necessarily become independent, they just be run more intelligently as places to live. So yeah, I would say we'll have colonies, we'll have private enterprise. Those colonies are going to need water and they're going to need resources. Well, gee, private enterprise could surely provide that from the asteroid belt. You'll see that kind of thing going on. You know, freedom will feed this very aggressively. So in 200 years, I expect to see colonies and possibly free nations on other worlds independent of the Earth. The Earth is the old world. The Earth is going to be hidebound. The United States illustrates it now very top-down, much too much top-down control. It's the cathedral, you might say, and the colonies will be the bazaar, and they will be promoting freedom. Look, American independence rebuilt England. England's government was corrupt. It was very top down. It was not producing very much. They believed very much in controlling industry and controlling product sales. They restricted all colonial products, had to be sold through England. And so they had no competition. It was one of the Navigation Acts, one of the reasons we revolted. What was interesting about that is the same year the Declaration of Independence occurred, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776. And England, after that revolution, rethought its entirely political process to get rid of patronage, to encourage free enterprise, and to not oppress its colonies. And it's one of the reasons the British Empire's colonies, except for the United States, mostly did not revolt. They stayed with as a Commonwealth together, empire, because Britain no longer was more willing to allow them to be prosperous for themselves. And England learned from that. And so the colonies in space are going to teach the old world lessons that it has forgotten, I hope.
That's a very hopeful vision. I hope it turns out like that. I know.
I am an optimist. Events of the last few years have really made my optimism struggle. But the general events of the last few years, the very oppressive circumstances of the last few years, very much so, the willingness of Americans to accept oppression, worldwide people to accept oppression, it's very depressing. But within the space industry right now, there are great hopeful signs. And if that can just keep going, it eventually can lead the way to fixing the problems elsewhere. And that's my hope.
I know you mentioned that you didn't think you would be selected for a mission to space because of your age. But if it were possible, would you take a trip to space?
Yeah, I would. Look, like I say, I've done cave exploration. I've gone where no one's gone before. I actually have been in places no one else. I was the first one to stick my head into a cave, and no one else had seen it before. So I would be willing to do that. Physically, I'm not sure health-wise I'm the right candidate. I might, for health reasons. As a journalist and as a historian, yes, I might be a very good candidate to go up there. I don't have the money to pay the bills. So someone's going to have to offer me the flight, and then I have to decide where they want to go. I wouldn't waste my time, though, doing a Jeff Bezos. So just in case Jeff Bezos is listening and he maybe wants to offer me a ride on New Shepard, a quick jump up and down for the publicity, I'm not interested in the slightest. I doubt that Jeff Bezos is going to do that. But if he does, I'm not interested. If I was going to go into space, I want to go into space for real. And that means an orbital flight.
Would you consider immigrating to Mars?
No, not in my lifetime. I'm not the person to go there because it's going to require pioneers in those early days. And I'm no longer the person to be that pioneer. And I don't mean that because of my age and the circumstances. I would not be the right person to send. You need young, healthy families and good and hard-nosed, passionate people who are willing to take the risks. And I'm willing to take the risks, but I'm not going to be able to provide them the kind of needs that they will need. My job on Earth right now is to describe how to do it right, and that's what I've spent my life, actually the last 25 years since I became a historian, space historian, since the mid-90s. That's basically what I've been doing. And I'm hoping, I pray that future space explorers read what I've written, because I more than any other historian, I've documented the first century of space exploration more than anyone else. There is nobody else who's done this as thoroughly as me. So I would hope people read what I've written down the road, and especially Conscious Choice. My dedication to Conscious Choice is specifically to Elon Musk, begging him to read the book when he builds his, so that when he builds his colonies on Mars, he does it right.
That sounds good. We'll have to see if we can make that happen. I need to read it first, though, so I can't recommend a book I hadn't read. But do you have children?
No, my wife and I got married very late in life. But part of my life story is growing up in the 60s, I learned a lot of bad lessons in the 60s that didn't understand, the 60s generation did not understand the fundamental concepts that built America. And in my life, over the years, as I began to write these histories and began to explore the history of the United States, my whole life changed. And so I didn't get married until somewhat late, and it was too late to establish a family. But I also began to realize how my generation, the baby boomers, got misled, because they really didn't understand. They weren't taught by their parents properly, sadly, the fundamentals of American culture that I outlined very clearly in Conscious Choice, what built the country. And these were ideas that existed very, if you watch 1960s TV shows about like Daniel Boone, or even the original Star Trek, or any number of other 50s and 60s TV shows, you will see it, the emphasis on family and children. You will see that, and you'll be surprised by it, because it's very rarely seen in modern culture now, in the media, the culture of the TV, the movies, and the books you read. But it was pervasive in those days. And my generation didn't understand that. So my life is that way. That's why I don't have kids. But, as the old saying, if I knew then what I know now, life would have been very different. But I didn't. So
hindsight is 2020.
Yes,
lots of ways of expressing it.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, so imagine this. It's 200 years in the future. There's a person in high school doing in history class, writing a paper about the 2020s. Okay. What do you hope she could write in her paper about this current time?
If she was going to write about this time, of course, much of it's going to depend on what the culture she lives in 200 years in the future, what it considers important. I am hopeful that what her culture considers important will be the foundations of private enterprise that got us into space, finally. Remember, we landed on the moon in late 69 and through 1972 or so, and haven't been back since, and have done no space exploration of any kind since then. And so it's only now in the 20s that that's finally beginning to happen again. And why is the question that I would hope they ask in 2220, 200 years from the future. I hope they ask the question, why did it suddenly begin to happen after a 50-year gap? What stopped it? And then that question to ask is, why did the US win so handily in the space race in the 60s? What made the US succeed? And they're the same answer. It has to do with freedom and private enterprise. Freedom, more than anything else, a freedom, a bottom-up culture that decentralizes power and allows people to follow their dreams. And that's what I hope this person, male or female, in the future looks back and sees, because in this time period now, that's the big story right now. That is the story. Just once again, we have 4 different space station projects in the United States funded and under construction at this moment in time, all commercial, all private. 4, not one program, 4. And that's, how could that suddenly be the case now? And it's partly because NASA has no longer trying to build it itself. It's now asking others to build it for it. And it's because we have competition and freedom. And so that's what I would hope that. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but this is so important. And people have forgotten it. I had an essay, Elon Musk gave a speech in September of 2011, right near the beginning of Behind the Black, my website, at the National Press Club in DC. And I lived in DC at the time. So I went to this speech, I listened to it. And it was when he announced he was going to try to vertically land the Falcon 9 first stage. And of course, everyone said that's absurd. It can't possibly be done. I'd heard engineers and managers say for 50 years, this is never going to be possible. But during that speech, I wrote an essay called The Forgotten Word, because he was asked at one point, why did he come to the United States to do this from South Africa? And he tried to explain it, and he really himself didn't really understand what it was. And the reason he came here was freedom. He would have the freedom to pursue his dreams. And he was doing that right then and there. He was doing it. And so it's important, and it's been forgotten, and we have to emphasize it over and over and over again.
That's awesome.
I want to add one more thing, though. I hope in that history class in 2022, her book assignments include my books. I would hope that very much so.
Well, it does now. It does now. So I'm sure she's thankful of that.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, education is one of those things that the customer is okay with getting less of or something.
Oh, well, yeah, I would hope so, but choosing books, what the books will be read in 200 years, who knows? And, my books would be forgotten. I have no idea. We'll have to wait and see. I just hope that's not the case. I will say, once again, I'm an original source. I saw it happen myself, and I've written all these books about the actual occurrences that occurred, and have interviewed the actual people that occurred. When I wrote Leaving Earth, I went to Moscow for almost 2 months interviewing cosmonauts who actually flew in space to find out what actually happened, to try to get answers to questions that had not been publicly published. And so I got that information, and so I was able to write about it. It's why the book won an award. And so I would hope, yes, that future history classes include my books in their syllabus.
That's awesome. Well, Robert, it was such a pleasure to get to talk to you.
And pleasure to talk to you, Nathan.
And I look forward to reading your books myself. So,
hey, listen, you read them and you want to do a review, please feel free to do so. Absolutely. If you want a review copy, email me. I might consider that.
Well, and if you ever come to Houston, maybe you could come and speak at our North Houston Space Society.
Yeah, if I'm in Houston, I will be in touch with you about doing that. Absolutely.
That's awesome. Well, Robert, you have a good night, and I look forward to being in touch.
All right, very good, Nathan. Thank you very much for having me, and good luck, and keep your project going. It's a great idea.
Thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.